thank you for all the speakers for interacting with the students. Um, Now we start the final section of the workshop. So we have a keynote talk from Jayashree Kalpati Kramer, who is the chief of the Division of Artificial Medical Intelligence and endowed chair in the Data Sciences Department of Ophthalmology at the University of Colorado. Previously, she was an associate professor of radiology at Harvard Medical School, where she was actively involved in data science and AI activities. Her research spans the spectrum of novel algorithm development to clinical deployment. Her lab developed models for applications in radiology, oncology, and ophthalmology. So we're going to get a crash course in AI for medicine and what all can go wrong. So I'm looking forward to it.
So thank you for the invitation to be here. As this morning, we had really wonderful technical talks. Now we're going to do something quite different and go sort of into the clinical aspects of it. And so I'll sort of start it off, and then my partner in crime, Annie, will go into more eloquently describe all of the problems when you take some algorithms that we develop here and then actually get them into the field. So it's definitely going to be a little bit more, a lot more applied than what we've seen this morning. But what I'm really hoping is that by describing the real-life problems that we have, all of you who've got wonderful solutions for them, there's opportunities to collaborate. So if you think you see a problem and you think you know how to solve it, please come talk to me, because we have lots and lots of data that we can use to sort of validate your suggestions. So according to Praneeth, the goals of this, the theme for this workshop was sustainable growth and sustainable development goals, right? That was supposed to be one of the themes. So I figured we'd at least consider what that means. So we have 2 of those 17 themes were promote well-being and then reduce inequality among countries. So a lot of the work that we do is in global health. And I think what I wanted to talk about today is some specific applications and why things like federated learning might be quite interesting in that context. So one of the reasons that we might want to think about federated learning is that many countries have rules about data leaving the country. They have not made rules quite yet about model weights leaving the country. So I don't know what that means quite. So I think that's something that we need to continue to explore, is when they say the data cannot leave the country, can we do federated learning across borders? So I don't know how many people have tried it. There's been some experiments, but I think that's something that I'm sort of curious to see if we can do. So one of the areas that we work on is cervical cancer. It's it's got very high mortality and morbidity worldwide. And the sad thing about it is it's mostly preventable and treatable if caught early, but in many parts of the world, that's not happening today. So there's both a vaccine and there's also diagnosis and treatment. And if you do that in time, then you can sort of address that. It's really very much preventable through vaccination and diagnosis. The other interesting thing about cervical cancer, it's a fairly well understood mechanism. Pretty much every case is associated with HPV infection. And so this is sort of the flow from getting infection. It can disappear, but then in some cases it progresses to precancer. If you catch it at that stage, you can treat it and get rid of it. If you look at the mortality rates across the globe, you see this really sort of disparate map. So it's pretty bad. Even within the US, it's bad in certain areas, but you really see it parts of Africa, parts of South America, where you see very high rates of it. So the WHO has got this plan to address this issue by both a vaccination campaign as well as screening. The vaccination campaign is going to take a long time to make an impact. The screening can happen today. And so this is sort of an economic model of how both a combination of screening and vaccination can help. And this is a very large group of people led by the National Cancer Institute in the US, with people across the globe all working on this project. And there are 10 sites. This is the way it's going to work. So essentially, it's sort of you go into the local areas, women self-sample, get in HPV testing and typing. If they're HPV positive, then they're sent to a local clinic. And the typical, what people do today is essentially paint the cervix with acetic acid, look at it visually. Unfortunately, the visual examination rates are barely above chance, but that's what is happening today in terms of diagnostic accuracy. So it's not very, very great test. So there's a lot of interest in using AI to sort of improve that overall. And if it's positive, you test and treat right then. So the NCI had developed an algorithm. They got excellent accuracy, 91%. Everyone was very happy. And then they started to look at it in the clinic, in the field, and it completely fell apart. So, and we've heard a lot about distribution shifts. We've heard about other things that can go wrong. So the algorithm was trained on one camera system, and then they went into the field with a different camera system. The images look slightly different, and suddenly the model performance is essentially not there. So again, this morning we heard a lot about, both yesterday and today, we've heard about this notion of these models not working as well under distribution shifts. So again, based on the lessons, so they published a really wonderful lessons learned paper about all the things that they did wrong the first time around, and then, which is on the right side there. And so what we tried to do is address a lot of those issues and have a second version of the model. Right now, we're in the process of recruiting 100,000 women over the next year and a half, and then we are going to actually see how well our algorithm works in the field. And this is kind of scary, right? So a lot of what we talk about normally is on toy problems, or maybe even things like the next word prediction in your phone. But when you're talking about people's lives, if you don't get it correct, it is enormous risk, especially when you're talking about going into communities and this notion of trust that had been brought up, right? So you want the community to trust you, that you're doing something safe, that something is correct. And so we have to be a little careful about what we do there. So the other disease, we do a lot of work in this thing called ROP. It's a leading cause of preventable childhood blindness worldwide. Again, it's very much a problem more in low and middle income countries and places like India. Again, great treatment options, so diagnosis is important. But again, access to care doesn't exist. There's not very many pediatric ophthalmologists in India, for instance, and so how can we do that? So again, so there's a variety of reasons why it doesn't work so well. There's a lot of variability in the ground truth. There's insufficient number of people, and this is very much, again, a problem in many, many parts of the world. And so the way you diagnose this disease is looking at the back of your eye. Going from left to right, you see that as the vessels get more tortuous, the disease severity is higher. So it's from an algorithm perspective, it's relatively easy to train an algorithm to do so. But again, the challenges occur because of the camera differences, between protocol differences, but also because the color of the fundus is different in different populations. So if you train your algorithm to work on a Caucasian population and then take it to India, it looks different. It doesn't work as well. So again, when you're thinking about building these algorithms and deploying them globally, we had to think carefully about what the data used for training was. So we've shown that the algorithm that we do can help with the inter-rater agreement issue. It can be used to improve access to care, reduce the number of follow-up visits, but also do things like improving outcomes. So we've looked at hospital systems and used this model to quantify disease severity across hospital systems and found a hospital that doesn't work as well. And so then we can go back and sort of examine what's going on there and then come back and say, okay, they didn't have enough blend oxygen monitoring. They had all these issues. So we went back 2 years later and found that a lot of those issues had been fixed. So based on these and other experiences, we've done a lot of sort of going from something we built in the lab to deploying it and have learned a lot of lessons, somewhat humbling experience, actually. The models don't generalize. I mean, this is something that I mentioned earlier, everybody has mentioned, but one of the biggest problems is that you build a model in one place, you take it somewhere else, it doesn't work as well, especially in sort of medical imaging. We had issues with the models not being repeatable. So many diseases lie on a spectrum, but we force them into bins, so it's not a binary, it's not yes or no, it's sort of a spectrum, and right around the boundary between positive and negative, the models are not very repeatable. Calibration is a huge issue. Our models are not well calibrated. And very often we don't see calibration curves. We don't know how well calibrated the models are. There's lots of silent failures. The models are confidently wrong. And that's a big problem. What we hope is we have measures of uncertainty that translate to the likelihood of it being wrong. But what we see is that it's confidently wrong. And that's a problem for us. Explainability. Most of the methods that have traditionally been used for explainability don't seem to work as well as we'd like them to. And the models can be biased in extremely hard to detect ways. And I'll come to that in a second. So the distribution shift has been, again, in medical imaging, talked about a lot. Very few of the algorithms that are FDA approved in the US have actually been tested on external data sets, which is a problem, again, because the algorithms have gone through the FDA process where they were just trained and tested on the same sort of one single scanner system, so we don't know how robust they are. So the things we see are scanner differences, protocol differences, prevalence disease differences, the disease differences. But the one that's really hard to deal with is this potentially confounding between things of interest. So for instance, if you look at breast density and you look at race and you look at breast size, they're all, there's an interplay in a way that the models sort of pick up on shortcuts. They don't pick up on the thing of interest, they pick up on shortcuts. And so we have to be careful that we're not doing shortcut learning. So again, we trained on one scanner, one institution data, tested on another. On the diagonal, you get great performance. Off diagonal, the performance is terrible. If you have access to everything, you get a good model. If you do federated learning, you get a good model. Yeah, it seems to learn scanners first and then diseases. The same thing is true for the fundus photographs. You train on one population and you test it on that same population, you get excellent performance. You train it on the North American population and test it on Nepal, you get terrible performance. Same thing was true in cervical cancer. You trained on one camera, you get, again, the on-diagonal elements are excellent, the off-diagonal elements are really terrible. The other issue we have is ground truth. We don't know what ground truth is, because we often rely on what's in the clinical record or what the doctor says, but that's not necessarily always truth. There's an opinion. So you get the same set of images as 8 different doctors to grade them on in this particular case, a 3-point scale. It's color-coded by that, and you see they have completely different answers. Some people have a lot more reds, and some people have a lot more greens. And now when you're training the model based on one doctor and testing it on another doctor, you find that this is a challenge. And when you're thinking about doing this in a federated setting, you don't even know that, right? So you don't have access to the ratings from the different sites. So how do you know that your ratings are biased or noisy? So that's something that I think we continue to sort of struggle with, especially in a federated setting. Shortcut learning. These models pick up on spurious signals. This model for for COVID, for instance, I think this was COVID, or pneumonia, was picking up on the marker. Basically, there's the marker on the image that says if it's left or right, and that says whether the patient was taken in a prone or a supine position, meaning are they lying or standing, or face up or face down, and whether they were standing and lying, and it really depended on whether they were in an emergency room or in a walk-in clinic. And all the model was learning is the fact that this patient came from an emergency room and not that it's something about the disease severity. So this gets even more complicated to figure out when we're in a federated setting, because we can't see the data. We can only see sort of the local data. We can't see all the data from the other sites. So how do we sort of learn that? This is something that has come up a lot, is that our models are trained on very non-diverse data sets. Most of the publications, most of the published models, at least in the US, are coming from essentially 3 states. And most of the rest of the world is not represented in the data sets that have been released or the models that have been released. And obviously, that's not great either. I don't know if you guys have seen this work, but this is absolutely fascinating. Just looking at a chest X-ray, the model is able to learn what self-reported race is. How? Nobody knows. No clinician can do that. What is it that this model is picking up that it seems to do so well? And what are the implications, again, for that in a setting, especially in a federated setting, where you don't know what sort of spurious signals it might be picking up on data that you cannot see? There's a lot of questions of bias. We see a lot about how these models can be biased and what that means, especially in the medical imaging space. A really cool area, sort of the flip side of all of this is this cool area of oculomics. So just looking at the photograph of your back of the eye, the models seem to be able to tell all kinds of things about you. What's your risk of cardiovascular disease? Are you male? Are you female? What's your BMI? How old are you? How? Again, no human can do that. These models can tell you if you're going to have Alzheimer's disease in 5 years, if you have Parkinson's disease today. So they are phenomenally good at these sorts of things. But given that the humans are not there, cannot do it, how do we check? How do we check it under distribution shifts? How do we maintain fairness under distribution shifts when we don't even know how to validate it? At a minimum, we need more data. We need diverse data, and that's where, again, the opportunities with federated learning, I think, are so huge, is that we cannot afford to just have models built on a single institution data from a very small section of the population. We need lots and lots of data. So we're hoping that they help us build more generalizable models. We don't know for sure that they do. And some experiments have suggested that they don't necessarily do that. When you have 3 scanners and you build a federated model for those 3 scanners, it works well. You bring in a 4th and a 5th scanner, it doesn't necessarily work well on those. So that is something that I think, as a field, we need to figure out more. The area that we are interested in is rare diseases. There's really not enough data at a single institution to build a model, so we definitely have to have federation there. And hopefully, when we allow people to collaborate, we bring in more diverse data sets. So this is an experiment we did with this ROP, which is a very rare disease. Some institutions have very small number of patients. Some have no positive cases. And what we essentially showed is that by doing federated learning, we can get a model that works at least as well as a central model. And some of it really has to do with the training set size. If you really don't have enough data at your institution, then it's really hard to figure out how to do that. And also, the number of positive cases is important. So the question that had been asked this morning that I thought was a really interesting one is, what does it mean in this era of foundational models, right? Does the fact that we now have foundational models change anything? Do we still need federated learning? Do we think we can get away with just having a foundational model that is like super useful for every task, and you just do fine-tuning on your local data? So that's something I would love to hear other people's opinion on. So our very recent and very small experience is perhaps you don't need quite as much, in the sense that if you have a really good foundational model and you fine-tune it on your data, it seems to work quite well. And so we'll continue to explore that. But I really would love to hear other people's opinion as to whether you need to do that. So this was a really good, interesting work from Moorfields and Google, I guess. And essentially what they did was build a foundational model using 1 million color fundus photos as well as 1 million OCT images. So they built this foundational model, they made it available publicly, and then they showed that it works really, really well for downstream tasks. So they had a whole bunch of tasks, both in sort of traditional tasks like ophthalmology related, so can you identify diabetic retinopathy, can you identify glaucoma, but also these really sort of tasks that are surprising, right? Can you predict Parkinson's? Can you predict heart disease? Can you predict MI? So, and again, having this foundational model seemed to be really good in order to do that. This is some work that Daniel Rubin and other people at Stanford did in sort of combining federated learning with with self-supervised learning, and seemed to suggest that, again, that might be a useful approach. So yeah, we've been playing around with some of these models. So we've been looking at, again, MAEs and Dino and other things in terms of the cervical tasks as well as the ophthalmology tasks. And it does seem like we get good performance. So it seems to, with a number of cases of the new domain, it seems to learn well. And so that's something that we'll continue to be exploring over the next few weeks and months. We heard a lot about incentives yesterday. That's something that especially in this global context, we have to think very carefully, and maybe Annie will talk about it as well. But how do we incentivize people to participate, not just here for a research paper, but really for sort of good of both their own local environment as well as sort of a global model. So it's usually like, what is it in for me, because it's a lot of work. There's no resources. Doing federated learning is not trivial. Getting people to have infrastructure to do that is not trivial. Not trivial here, not trivial, especially where there's like in the places we are doing the cervical cancer screening, there's barely enough bandwidth to send the data to a cloud. Now asking them to say, okay, let's do federated learning seems like a big ask. So how do we incentivize participation? What are the true risks? Many governments want to know, when you're sending the data out, what are some of the risks? I mean, we're saying we're not sending the data, we're sending the weights, but what are the true risks that they should be worried about? How do we think about uncertainty? This universal question of, do we want a single global model? Do we want personalization? In medical domains, it's usually hard to change because you have FDA approval and the model's sort of frozen. How they are thinking about continuous learning, but do we want personalization? Do we want global? Do we want, where do we want to go? This question of unlearning, right? So we've trained a federated model across data from multiple sites. One person now says, take my data out. Are you allowed to do that? How do we think about that? When we've had conversations, I mean, we heard a lot about Shapley values yesterday, but people have different opinions. I mean, this is the stakeholders, the participants, whether you should count. How do we measure quality, right? How do we make sure that we're getting good quality data? How do we, diversity? So often the measures that we use don't necessarily pick up on the fact that you may not have the small subset of population that you need, because the model performance is sort of global aggregate and not in that very small subset. For instance, we had a COVID model. It worked really well, except for extremely obese people. And we didn't know that till much later in the process. So how do we know what attributes of the patient change the performance of the model? So lots of questions that I hope everybody here can help us with. How do we deal with heterogeneity? I saw some interesting posters, but we have all kinds of it, right? We have covariate shifts, we have label shifts, we have concept shifts. All of them happen routinely in our domain. One thing we keep worrying about is, how do we know that the model is no longer working? And there's been a lot of work in looking at data drift and sort of, how do we put guardrails? How do we have meaningful guardrails that say, okay, if your data has deviated from something, you should be very careful about applying a model to that data. Calibration is something we need to think about. Uncertainty quantification that is meaningful. So a measure of uncertainty that somehow helps us know that the model is not confidently wrong. How do we do federated learning in a resource-constrained settings? The question I guess I had is, are these just global problems? Are they unique to something we're doing? But these are the things that are especially challenging for us. So we cannot make errors, right? We're talking about people and cancer screening. We really cannot make errors. How do we deal with calibration? The data are almost always non-IID. the interoperability, especially in a federated setting where you cannot see the data, is a huge challenge. The images are labeled, the sequences are labeled differently. It's very hard to know, are we talking about the same thing? We deal with very small data sets compared to other problems. The ground truth is very sort of murky. So I was trying to get a generative model to give me a good image. I failed completely. But I wanted to sort of have two sides of this coin, right? So people have, I thought a really important quote, which is, it is unethical to not allow AI to be sort of used in places where it's needed. If you have a model that is good and is better than what is happening locally, then it is our moral obligation to sort of put it out there. On the flip side of it, we have all these concerns about bias, about ethics, this notion of digital divide. And so I was really trying to get a good example of that. I failed miserably. But I think that is something that we think a lot about, is this notion of when is it good enough to deploy? What are the things that we have to be worried about? So thank you.
Questions? Yeah. Maybe you can start your closing.
Okay. Thank you. That was just a really wonderful talk. And you're doing all of these things under very kind of controlled conditions, and you're following it up to make sure that the models are safe when they're being used, and you're doing randomized control trials. But just to kind of also open up to other people about what's happening in the real world in the industry. So I'm working with Fine Diagnostics, which is basically like a WHO tried to make sure that there was a validation process for all of these AI models that are commercialized, right? So what's happening in the private sector is that there's some AI models that are being used for automatic diagnosis of X-rays, and they're being sold to governments. And they're being sold to governments because they have 99.99% accuracy, right? And there's no guardrails. There's no guardrails, and they're being sold to the poorest populations ever, and there's no safety net when they go wrong. So if they go wrong, you don't have some doctor that's backing them up. And so what we're doing with them is we're building a validation platform where you can basically, it's kind of like a Kaggle-esque kind of competition. And just to kind of ask the question, you're 99.99% accurate, says who, right? Says who? And what we found was really, really scary. And these models that are being used in practice are sometimes slightly worse than random.
Yep.
And so I just wanted to say, I don't have a question, but I wanted to say that you're doing this the right way. And, I'm also running lots of randomized control trials. And I really think that that's the future, is to try to take the models that we're making and to test them, because no one else is.
Right.
And so thank you. What lovely work.
Thank you.
I don't know, anyone else?
I think there was a question here before.
Yeah, a nice talk, very realistic. So I had a question on what the calibration problem is referring to. Is it the calibration with respect to different scanners, or is there, so what is it referring to in the medical?
So if you plotted a calibration curve of probability versus deciles of occurrence, the models are really poorly calibrated. And they're very often confidently wrong. And that's the part that scares us, because they'll be quite confident about the answer, but be wrong. And so how do we know that they're wrong?
So this is somewhat different than like a multi-label black box model prediction, or the problem is that different from a multi-label classification?
Even a binary classification, the models can be, if you just plot a calibration curve, they don't look.
Oh, maybe I'm missing what the calibration curve means, I guess. Maybe it's a very silly question.
No. The way we plot calibration curve is you essentially take deciles or whatever of probability from 0 to 1 and say what fraction in that each bucket was a positive case versus a negative case. And that should be, if if the model is well calibrated, it should go, it should follow that line. And very often they're not. So people do temperature scaling, people do a variety of things to get the models to be recalibrated, but those things break under distribution shift sometime. So.
I see. Yeah.
Thank you for the great talk. I agree that having diverse data is very important. But think about in federated learning, when you allow different parties to contribute that data, it's possible that some clients, they may contribute low quality data. Yeah, it can be the noisy labels, or for example, they have the old version of scanners in such case. And sometimes those kind of low quality data may come in from those minority groups. So I feel like there might be some contradictory needs that we want something that have good performance, diverse data, and also we want to pursue fairness. I would appreciate your comments to this point.
I think it's a great point. I have no comments. I think it's a really important point, but I think you're completely correct, is that very often there can be an association with data quality and disease severity, for instance. So in the eye, for instance, you get poor quality data when in a more diseased patient. Same thing with like a chest X-ray or even a brain scan. When a patient is a sicker patient will move more. So there's an association with low quality but more disease. So I think you're completely correct in that they can be at odds. So trying to get a good representation of different things can also mean that quality goes down, and potentially the overall model goes down as well because you have bad quality in it. So I agree. That's all I can say.
Yeah, thank you for your comments.
Thank you. Thank you for the great talk. I wanted to ask you about the role of uncertainty and whether, well, I assume it makes a difference whether we're talking about the epistemic or aleatoric uncertainty, so whether it is the data or the model. And if it is the model, then maybe you can get away with it with better generated data also.
Right.
If it is about the data, then you might look into, like as a community, we might look into active learning solutions. So how can you prioritize certain data over other? I don't know if you have any further comments, actually.
No, I agree. I mean, I think trying to separate those two is challenging. And I think certainly some things we can do in terms of, but the active learning is something we've done with, especially in trying to figure out the next case to get labels on. So that can help find the cases that are more uncertain, for instance, and help with that. But active learning is something that, especially in medical annotation tasks, has been quite useful.
Do you have any comment about the active learning and then the motive to actually contribute good data in the active learning subdomain?
The last part I didn't hear.
So in the active learning subdomain that we're talking about, do you have any comment about what is the motive for the federated entity to contribute good data?
Yeah, I mean, incentives are challenging, right? So.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? So I just wanted to make a comment about this. I don't know, the point you made about we don't really know why those models are answering the way they are.
Yeah.
There's this line, there's this work by like Senthil Mullainathan, I saw you cited one of his work, on hypothesis generation, where they basically train a
counterfactual studies.
Yeah, exactly, like a generative model. I'm curious if anyone tried that.
We've spent a lot of time doing that. So we've created a generative model that flips the class and looked at the difference of it, and we think we have something, but it's definitely speculative at best. So one of our students is writing that up. But essentially, when we did that, and we looked at it in the race, chest X-ray race domain, it seemed like it was highlighting like the bones around the clavicle and the right around here, as well as some something in the, just around the base of the lungs. So it was a clear signal, and we could definitely flip. So the way we did it is we trained a model to go from one race to the other. We looked at the differences and confirmed that the classifier was predicting it correctly in the other one. And then looked at the areas that were highlighted in this. There were things that seemed like it was happening, but I just worry about some of the, it's a little speculative, so yeah. But if anybody solves that, I'd be really curious to see what it is.
I just have a small comment on that. I used to volunteer for the police force when we used to find bones in the field or something, and they want to identify if they're human or animal or what race. And it's interesting because we had some things you'd measure the clavicle
right.
and make a whole lot of measurements and put it into something, but you can't see it as a human.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be able to see it on an X-ray, but with a whole lot of very complicated measurements, we were able to do it. So
we should definitely talk. Maybe that is it. It was exactly that. I mean, it was right around the clavicle that it was picking up. So.
Yeah, it's the clavicle versus the length of lip of the glabella or something. And, I don't know, whatever. But yeah, you got it.
Cool.
Thanks so much, Shashi. Medical informatics and data science at Yale. Her research is focused on developing and validating novel data-driven tools designed to improve healthcare in low-resource and humanitarian response settings, with a special interest in Africa. She started the Intelligent Global Health Group at EPFL, and she continues this at Light, which at Yale. And she maintains strong partnerships between EPFL and Yale, as well as she's affiliated with the CMU Scilab in Africa. Thank you, Annie.
Yeah, we'll turn it on. No.
Taste 1, 2.
Yeah.
Is
Is it working? Do you prefer this?
I think I'll try this. It's
Yeah.
fine.
I'll get this here.
Am I logged in?
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And also,
she's gonna share her
she's here
presentation,
despite
her
just on the recovery from malaria. So she's I'm really amazed and thankful that she could make it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, now you should have it, and please on Zoom, can you make her Zoom? Just make her. Okay, can you make it on the screen? Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Just so they can see it clearly. Yeah. Do we have it? Can I have it on the screen? Yeah. There you go.
Okay. Good. It's fine. I don't think it works for me. Okay. All right. So, hi everyone. And if you don't, I didn't hear if Praneeth introduced me, but this isn't my style. This is really, I lost my voice, so I'm not trying to be husky or mysterious, but I'll try my best to not have a coughing fit during this, right? So I'm going to be speaking about humanitarian collaborative learning and hopefully also giving some examples about how we can integrate these humanitarian principles as well as the use cases into all the things that we are doing on a day-to-day basis for like all the theoretical kind of problems that we have. Why not make these like use cases that you're formulating your problems for real world and have them have some like real world use cases that can actually be used. And my argument here today is that if we focus on integrating humanitarian use cases as well as the principles into federated learning, we can actually use that to achieve some of the sustainable development goals. So the content of this talk is very basic. There's two parts to it. We're first going to really try to formalize what is a humanitarian response and try to find out what the data in the humanitarian response is. What is the journey? Who collects it? What is it? Where does it go? And how, why, and when is it collected? And how we can use it in federated learning. And then we talk about something that's known in the field as the nexus point. How does this humanitarian data, how does it actually get to the point that we can use it for development purposes? And then the second part is basically trying to find out how you can make this humanitarian collaborative learning, making some sort of semantic mapping between the humanitarian principles and how you can integrate them into the methodology of federated learning. And I do that with some examples because I've been in a kind of collaborating for quite a long time with NGOs in this space. So I tried to go on DALI 3, so GPT-4, and just trying to find out, what is humanitarian response? And I got this very kind of apocalyptic image, just bodies strewn everywhere. It looks like a lava pit somewhere in the middle there, and to some extent, this is true about humanitarian response. We do a lot of very acute response, and but this is actually very like a minority of how time is spent in this very kind of chaotic situation. It's a coordinated effort that aims to, without any cliche, save lives. That's what they're measuring to try to see if they are successful. It alleviates suffering and maintains human dignity. And of course, it does this in an acute way as well. But if I tried to prompt DALI to say, well, what is long-term humanitarian response? It looks extremely organized. And that's how it is. And the activities that are being delivered, of course, is emergency relief for food and water and shelter and medical care. But there's also protection, support, healthcare services, water and sanitation, food security and nutrition. And some of these should start already sounding like the Sustainable Development Goals because they very much are. And one of the most important things that they do is they do needs assessment and monitoring, collecting data, a lot of it, and meticulously. And it's data that's often neglected because it's not accessible at all. So you can really see that a lot of those things really align with the Sustainable Development Goals. And in such, actually humanitarian response is really a microcosm of the SDGs. But instead of being goals, it's actually actions that are happening. And data is being collected on these things at scale. And the most important thing is that it's being collected in the most neglected and vulnerable populations in the world. So if you're looking to do Sustainable Development Goals, which is to reduce inequity, you've got a fantastic representation of data of these very vulnerable and neglected populations. So how can you actually use this data and when do you kind of stop collecting it and when does humanitarian response become development? This is called the nexus point. It's really when humanitarian aid and peace and security build a foundation that's stable enough for us to then build on that to get development and cooperation. And so all the data that's collected in those two activities can really be used as a foundation to make models in this space. So what is the data that's being collected? There's actually a huge amount of standards, and the standards that are kind of guiding principles for humanitarian response are, this is just one of the handbooks that is trying to guide them to say it's very much looking like the Sustainable Development Goals. It will say like, well, if you want to say that you're doing like health services delivery, you better prove it. you better prove it by, if you want to say that you're delivering it, your indicators of success are over here. It's about the percentage of population that can actually access primary care within 1 hour's walking distance of their dwellings. And they give indicators, well, it better be 80% if you think that it's successful. And so because they're getting funded for these things, they really collect them very rigorously. And I've had the opportunity to look at these huge data sets by ICRC and others, where they're collecting massive, massive amounts of data, and they actually don't have any capacity for data analysis beyond something in Excel sheets. So the data is there, but it's just not being used for like a higher level prediction tasks. So the data's journey is also very tortuous, and this is why federated learning is really going to be essential in leveraging it all. Before we even get to the bottom of the people who are actually collecting it, who are the people in the field, those humanitarian response agents, we actually can just start where it goes to in the end and who mandates it. It's really like the states and international organizations, multilateral and regional development banks, UN agencies like WHO, and also national organizations like the CDC and NHS, for example, as well as the military. And in between that are just a multitude of partnerships and people who the data has to go to for reporting because they're getting funding from different partnerships. Gavi for the vaccines. The Global Fund is a partnership between a whole lot of different nation states as well as different funding organizations. And then we can only get to the bottom, and this is just a small amount. I mean, the people who are acting on the ground, for instance, in Haiti, in the 2010 earthquake, there was an estimated 10,000 different people collecting data, and some of them very inexperienced, unfortunately, on the ground, creating quite a lot of chaos. So there's a real need to organize this. And even within the ICRC, which is the International Committee for the Red Cross, this is the oldest and most established NGO in the world. It's been operational for over 100 years. It was really one of the first, and it's operational in 160 countries and in every single conflict and war zone, basically. Even within them, there's this hierarchy of data transfer where you're first going from the national societies of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent to the Federation of the Red Cross, which are national societies, and then they go up into the Red Cross in the International Committee in Geneva. So people have tried to map this complexity of where data goes, and it's been basically impossible. And this is just like, this is color-coded just on like some internet kind of scraping. This is like where they're coming from. So the orange is the UN system, and then there's the gray, which is global and civil societies, which are quite a lot of them. And there's been quite a few different ones like this. So these are the countries that they are dispersed in. Sometimes you may be in Gaza, but you're reporting to Canada, you know. So a lot of international borders need to be crossed as well. And here it's just like on top of that, there's scope. So actually you normally are kind of doing within your cluster, as it's called. So if you're health, you're in the health cluster. And if you're WATSAN or water and sanitation, you're in that cluster. And so you've also got to kind of like share data between clusters as well. And not only that, in each country and in each region and in each response, there's a different kind of mess of organizations in this way as well. That's not to discourage you. There are a lot of coordination activities, and a lot of them rely, unfortunately, on centralization, which just doesn't work. So OCHA, which is the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, will have a structure something like this, where they've got all of these clusters under shelter, education, health and protection, etc. And they will then kind of report upwards in this hierarchical structure, and the data will eventually go to the top somewhere, right? So the thing is that these centralized architectures don't work for many reasons, and it's not just the NGOs that are on the ground. These centralized solutions, obviously, as we already know, are copy-pasting data to a central server somewhere in the end. And these people that are the users on the ground can also be academic institutions and private organizations, and often private organizations have some of the most valuable data as well. This copy-pasting actually requires a lot of things that we already have been speaking about, which most important is the loss of ownership. And in these low-resource settings, that's also called data colonialization, which is really important because people lose trust and they don't even want to work with the organization anymore when they see that they're taking away a valuable asset. There's also a loss of intellectual property. When people realize that their data has value and it's being taken away, they basically can't even apply for other grants and funding because that's what the higher resource setting will end up doing. And so who wins here is really the person who's got the model and the person who's getting the data. It's also a huge amount of work. It's laborious to actually prepare this. You are accountable and you are responsible for whether the data is actually anonymized or not. And you hope it's anonymized, but actually privacy is something that degrades over time. And without increasing ability to identify it, you can't actually even guarantee that it's going to be private in these settings. So even if we decide to do this, anyway, there's going to be people who just can't participate. And it's going to lead to unrepresentative data. And the people who don't have the resources to participate in this are going to be the people who are the least able let's say, the least vulnerable, the most vulnerable people are not going to then be represented. So there's another thing is that we have these kind of pushbacks every time we're dealing with data and sharing with humanitarian organizations is that they say, well, this doesn't align with our humanitarian values. And in the centralized kind of setup, that's quite clear. But as Jeshuri was just saying before, what happens when you're sharing model weights? How does that align with humanitarian values? And so we have a whole new kind of paradigm that we have to put into place. So even if you flip the paradigm now and you go and put the models in and you distribute them to the users, you might say, well, okay, we've now kind of like addressed the whole ownership thing, everyone wins, that's great, and we can now say that we've kind of like reduced those problems, but as we were saying before, you still have to kind of make sure that it's interoperable unless you can be robust to these shifts in data between places, so there's still a certain amount of laborious effort that's involved. And even if you go and learn these things, as Jeshuri was saying before, does this line with humanitarian values? What are we sharing? How do we communicate what we're sharing? What's the trust that you can put into a model, like a system like this, when there's no examples? So, and what kind of models do you want to learn? Do you want to learn a model that generalizes well on everyone or personalize them? So all those questions you were raising before were very, very relevant. And so what are these humanitarian principles that they say don't align? They're very simple. They're words, 7 of them, and I just put a last one in there as well. It's humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, unity, and universality. They might have been established by the ICRC because these are really the principles that the ICRC was one of the first NGOs, but they are followed by many other NGOs as well. And now these might kind of seem a bit fuzzy, but I'm trying to say that we can actually do very concrete methodological mapping on these principles in federated learning to make sure that it's adopted by places like this. So go to the easiest one, right? Unity is pretty simple. If you look at the humanitarian definition, it's, collaboration. Collaborative learning, it's a tick box. It's pretty easy. This is just one I can say. I don't even need to make a methodological mapping. Unity is, collaboration. It's sharing resources, having a shared goal. And when you have, basically, your shared goal is learning something that's a specific target in a model, it's quite easy to understand the mapping between unity and federated learning. And having these kind of international and local as well collaborations as well is very important, and just scaling your federated learning in this way is a way to do it. Humanity is more of kind of a fuzzier concept, but actually what we can say is here if humanity is, in a humanitarian setting, is about assistance being focused on saving lives, right? Alleviating human suffering and protecting dignity, and having this kind of beneficence and non-maleficence to make sure that we kind of are maximizing good and reducing bad. But I would even go further and to say reducing doing useless things, so things that are not targeted on a specific use case, wasting time basically, and things that are not targeted on something that is actually maximizing benefit. Then we are really focusing on the orange things here, which is the model. What is your model actually doing? What is your use case designed for? Have you thought about how your use case could maximize something that's in the real world? So if you want to ensure a beneficial target, it's really the nature of the model and making sure that you're building systems that are robust to work in places like this. So when you're making a use case, have you thought about the extreme use case? When you're making a use case, have you thought about how people would maybe respond to it in certain settings? And ensuring non-maleficent use, we had some great examples in this cohort already, where you guys were speaking about, privacy and being robust to malicious actors, because the malicious actors in these settings especially are real, and the consequences are quite catastrophic. And they are very nervous, ICRC, of having their data being leaked because they don't want to be able to participate in, for instance, if they're working in two sides of a war, they actually can then participate. Just people knowing the number of fatalities is in Ukraine would be actually informative for the government in Russia, and how many people have been hit with X kind of missile or machete or whatever is actually very informative as a war kind of information, as intelligence to them. So very difficult to know that even aggregate statistics can be dangerous. And so you have to kind of be aware of that, but you can't have this privacy or nothing approach either. Because if you make something that's really, really secure, but it is extremely computationally heavy, and you're using these cryptographic techniques that are really impractical, you're missing the point as well, because then no one's going to use it. So you have to kind of really define your use case very well. What do people really want? And I'm on time. And what do people really want? And how are we going to be able to actually put this into practice really? So just an example of some of the things that we've been doing. So we're a very needs-based lab. So we ask people, what do you need? What do you need from us? So what they wanted, they were like, we need so many models, we just want something that can do a little bit of everything. So they really wanted to focus on large language models. And we just actually had a seminar. I hosted a symposium, thank you, Praneeth, for participating, at 4 a.m. in the morning from Berkeley. So we had a seminar at ICRC explaining to them what large language models are, to prepare them for use and randomized control trials. So here we made a medical large language model, and for our 15 minutes of fame, it is the best one. It doesn't, it won't be for long, I'm sure, but it's open access and open source model called Meditron, and we basically are training it for being a medical chatbot, right? And so we based it on it's a Llama 2 base, and then we train it on very, very carefully curated data sets. And obviously some of those data sets and specifically guidelines, which are the highest level of evidence for beyond just a systematic review and a meta-analysis. A guideline is something that doctors actually make actionable. It's things that they actually follow in the clinic. And so when you've got this kind of this kind of information, it can really be very informative to the model. So right now we're quite happy with this model, and we are now going to try to do open validation of it as well. What's important, though, is how we made this model for them, right? So we're making a model that's we're trying to be useful, and then we try to incorporate the guidelines of ICRC, the guidelines of XYZ NGOs, and of low resource settings. And then when we do an open validation, when we're trying to do RLHF, we specifically go and engage people where the utility would be highest, right? It's easy to get volunteer doctors from high resource settings, which they've all agreed to, but now we're going to find funding to make sure that we can pay for doctors in low resource settings to validate the models as well. So this is one of the models that we're making, and now we're also going to make it extremely small, which we'll speak about later, just to make sure that we can actually continue learning on their own private data in a distributed way. So another task that these large language models will be very useful for in ICRC, their archives. Their archives are extraordinarily valuable. 100 years, over 160 countries, as I was saying before, documenting war crimes, documenting missing persons. There's so many things. The people, when you go out to volunteer with ICRC, there's such a high staff turnover that someone has done something in the field that failed. The next person comes, they'll do the same thing because there's no one to onboard them. So just to understand and to parse all of the documents and reports that have been made in the past is extremely valuable, and to have a chatbot for this is wonderful. This is just a snapshot of the archives that are now being digitized that we're going to have access to soon. And I'm really excited about this task because, these are really, it looks centralized here, but they're not. So they put in a whole lot of different places because of the sovereignty of the data, and we're really excited to explore this as well with them. So if you have any ideas of how to get compute that would help this, it would be very valuable, because those are going to be probably not OCR, those are going to be images of text that we have to put into this model. So very, very helpful to have some extra compute. So voluntary service, in a humanitarian perspective, this is values-based participation. Now people are paid when they are going to go and volunteer or doing field work. But I think that this kind of altruistic approach is very important, and I think that our community does that very well, because if we try to map this, we can make sure that things are open source and open access, and there's an open validation. But something that we often miss to do is to make it really accessible. And if you're making a methodology, where can it go? What is the next step after publication to maybe put it into something that is actionable? So if you've made an amazing thing that can really like change the way that you can make data private, come to me. I'd love to put it in our tool that we've made open access, and we're trying to make it kind of code-free environment for people to understand and use federated learning. So this is just another example where I was saying before, we're going to be doing this preference optimization on RLHF on these models, and just trying to kind of recruit the community in this voluntary action to try to rank once we prompt the model with their questions and try to generate a whole lot of different variations, try to rank their preferences as well, and do that on a very large scale. So that's one of the examples of us doing open validation. So, when I say accessible, we have this this is just a toy version that's online. It's called Disco for Distributed Collaborative Learning. And we have this platform where it's basically open source, open access, and it's a web-based tool. It supports federated and decentralized learning, and it's in this code-free interface, and you also can do a self-server launch. So it allows a lot of autonomy, which we'll see is going to be important soon. And you can even put this into apps and whatnot, but it's about making the technology accessible. So if you've got really good ideas and you just think, wow, this needs to be put into practice somewhere, please reach out, because we're not, the best at doing all the different things that need to be put in here. So we want to use your kind of tools that you're making in the community and make sure that we're delivering the best and highest quality inside the platform that we're making for them now. So then we have impartiality. There's only a few left, and then I'm done. So basically, this is a very easy one to map. In a humanitarian setting, it's assistance provided based on need without discrimination with respect to nationality, race, gender, etc., right? And so this is an easier one because it's biased. So, and if we want to make sure that our models are not biased and the way that we are learning our models are not biased, there's been several kind of examples here throughout the weekend. But it's also mostly about representation. And I think Jessary really said a lot about that as well, about how well things actually generalize in reality. And if we don't have a good representation of our data, we can't expect it to generalize to these things. I'm good. And then if we want to personalize things to make sure that we can represent them, we need to make sure that we can democratize performance. So we need to kind of balance bias detection, right, and representation with privacy. How can we be transparent when we've got these black box models, right? So this is really a data issue. You've got it's a black box model, but now you've also got black box data. So how can you really go into this and say, what is the difference between privacy and transparency? How can I be transparent with my data and still maintain that privacy? And what if a whole lot of data there's overrepresentation in one place? I think we've kind of come to the point where we can be robust to these kinds of things, but it's still a huge issue. So you can either go into, if you want to really deliver on this, you can either go and collect the data yourself, and this is what we do often. We have a lot of randomized control trials and observational cohort studies collecting data on Ebola and all the things that are kind of not represented in the literature. But we also go into the technical part, and this is a paper that we're going to be, that I collaborated also with Praneeth on, called My This, Your That. So it's a way of kind of comparing if you've got, I won't go into the details, and I put an equation here. I thought you were going to be sad without one. You don't need to understand it though. So here, sorry, but here if you've got one client that's got unbiased data, right, and you let them make a local model, so this LM is a local model, it'll say, hey, this is the prototypical part of your model, that's the most important, is over there. But if you go and like try to make a federation of this with another client that has biased data, that's learning from that example that Jessery had, for example, is learning from something up here, because it's got a systematic bias. What you can do now is you can kind of test this person's model. It's a bit more complicated than this. It's prototypical part learning, but you can test it on your own data, and you can at least see that it doesn't have the same logical mapping, and it's not using the features that you should feel comfortable with using. So at least it doesn't leak any of the data, but it's still kind of responding to that issue of transparency versus privacy. So the last one, I think it's the last one, it's like a minute, don't worry, right? So neutrality and independence. This is also quite easy to map. You don't take sides for political or funding, and it must be autonomous. And so this is kind of the thing about like giving ICRC their own server to let them do their own federated learning and to make sure that they can maintain it easily and within a code-free setting. They've just had to cut, for instance, like about 20% of the jobs in Geneva, and a whole lot more in the field because of like all the wars that are going on, and it's like a huge funding disaster. And which are the jobs that go first? Of course, all of their data support jobs. So academia can really step up here and like provide like an impartial and neutral. We shared so many of those principles, impartial and neutral kind of technical partner to help them through these kind of settings to make sure that they can actually use this invaluable data. So if you have any extra students that are looking for a meaningful kind of job, then please send them my way. So and then over here, this would be the issue of data sovereignty, model sovereignty, making sure that you can get them on-premises, learning on-premises, which obviously means optimization. And so optimization becomes one of the most important things to make sure that federated learning can actually work in practice. Because what you have here is, even if you decide, okay, fine, I can go, I can be completely impartial, not even have a server and go like, decentralized learning completely. The thing is that even then you're going to have issues of like it being really slow because there's no computational power, or that there's like bandwidth issues. So, we've worked a lot on this about like making one-round learning and zero-shot learning and making it extremely like just averaging, and some of these very simple techniques really work. So working on the extremes is really interesting as well. Okay, so for this, we are basically also we're making our model very small. So that's our Llama model up there. It's our Meditron model. And we're not quantizing it. We're actually trying to make it really, really small, modularizing it, and kind of taking away the chain of thought kind of burden in these large language models by actually integrating the data into a knowledge graph beforehand and making a whole lot of models, for example. So these are things that we are trying to do to make sure that the models are small enough so that they can continue to learn in really, really resource-constrained settings. And some of these kind of modularization techniques that we're using, like this is something that is in Europe's this week. And this is something that I work a lot on, is modularizing kind of the way that we are making models to make them extremely small, so that they're also very flexible and composable at the point of use. So instead of making one big model with all of these different things like we had heard previously as well, I think that that's a great idea from Eric Zing. But I think that it's also very difficult to imagine that it's working in the field. So to take this amazing idea, but just to make sure that you can compose it in any way that you want, and to kind of make a whole lot of models for each of the things that you want to put inside. And this is a way of doing it in a multimodal, multitask way, where you can kind of put them together in any way and just string them along in sequence. So I'll stop here, I think, as the last one. Okay, so this one is a very easy one. Universality, and it's kind of like a happy, upbeat note to end on, right? So it was originally made by just to make sure that all the different Red Cross societies felt like they were equal, right? So it's a really important one to map, because we also need to make sure that we can make technologies that can be used by everyone, right? And that there isn't this technological gap when we're making these really, really, really big models that require a lot of resources. So if we really want this to be sure that we can have like equal importance, we often don't want to do federated averaging, right? That's not the mapping here. It's about making appropriate aggregation techniques. It's about understanding the importance of personalization and not kind of discriminating against people because they have different data. And if their data is really bad, that it's bad compared to you, but it's representative compared to them. And so just one example about this, there's like people who just were not collecting respiration rate very well, right? How important is that? It's so important because if I'm making a model that's going to predict pneumonia based on respiration rate, and I know that they are not collecting respiration rate well, that is an essential thing to know. And I want to learn that. And I want to make a model for that. And I want to model that bad data because that's how it's actually in the field. So to say that data is bad is not very fair because it's always kind of relative. It's the data that is there. It's the data that's being collected, and that's how it's being collected. It's not always bad on its own. So yeah, hopefully that we can work together and we can make these kind of resource-adapted models. And that's it. I hope I've convinced you to work on some use cases in this field. And I'm only 3 minutes over, so I'll stop. Okay.
Questions? I think you managed to convince everyone. So I want to ask you this because you mentioned this, but we can also use this for like our discussion. You mentioned so there were 2 points, I think. One was this this LLMs and these distributed data sets. It's not super clear if you're training an LLM over these distributed data, like but you can still extract the data from the LLM because that's its purpose.
It seems exactly like an LLM, if you train it well, is going to actually represent the data, right? And there's no privacy because you're basically taking the data from different places and you're just putting it into a model, and then you can chat with it and you go, well, what's that? You know, like if you've trained it well, it will break all privacy, but you're not training it because of privacy. And also, you must remember where the model is allowed to be accessed. So in these settings, federated learning isn't just about privacy, it's about data sovereignty as well. And so if you're training a model like an LLM from different places that can't share their data because it has to stay on premises, you still can make a model that can be accessed by a select few people who have the ability to normally access that data but can now use it in a model. And so I think that's really important. That is not just about privacy. They're very interested in doing this because they have very clear kind of access controls about who can learn what data. And so to make models that are kind of restricted to this kind of security level is very important as well. So this like distributed learning for large language models or very small ones that are kind of connected by a knowledge graph and also separated in accordance to who can access the different kinds of information is something that's really interesting to them. Yeah.
So the archive project where you were trying to build an LLM for different querying of where missing people are. I found it very fascinating and potentially very useful and a very niche application. I was wondering at what stage this project is or how you foresee the different stages if it's a very early stage right now, I'm guessing.
Yeah, so it's such a fascinating project. So first of all, the archives contain so much, and they're in different stages of being archived. So there's ones that are super old that contain, and they kind of have to release them on a thematic base because of like kind of security controls. So I went to go visit them on Tuesday, actually. And the first ones that they want to release are newly digitized archives from the 1994 Rwanda genocide, and then another one from like the World War II. But these are like older ones, and it's kind of like test cases. And then they've got newer ones that we've been having access to that are being actively used at the moment. And so there's different questions in each of them. So the ones that we have access to at the moment, we did a lot of RAG on those and kind of like trying to make sure that we've got using smaller models to first retrieve some of the questions that are being asked. So it's a question answering model, and it's to really facilitate a newly onboarded person to understand more about the context. So these are the ones that we actually have right now are these in several countries where you can ask questions like, well, what was the success of this kind of strategy when it was implemented over the past X years? So we have question answering models like that. And then we have those other ones where they're looking for missing persons, for example. So they have this huge backlog of people calling them from for World War II, for other wars, to say, I've lost my uncle in X, or I've lost my great-great-grandfather in these areas. What information can you give me? And so they want to be able to facilitate their work because there's so many people asking them. So there's tasks about onboarding, and then there's tasks about finding missing people and to make their jobs a little bit easier as well. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so I did not understand your point about the data quality, the respiratory rate example that you gave. So what should ideally happen? Like if, let's say, one center or like one region is not collecting the data correctly, shouldn't we be helping them to improve the data collection process rather than trying to develop a model for them?
Oh, absolutely. In like the ideal world, but you'd be able to see it, and we were able to see it. So you've got these like models that are being models that will just be like a guideline coming down from the WHO, which is called the IMCI guidelines, or the Integrated Management for Childhood Sicknesses and Illnesses, right? So there it's a paper-based kind of thing to say, if you want to diagnose someone with pneumonia, they have to have a respiration rate of above 22, and they have to be this and that and that, and fever and whatever. And so these guidelines are being put into practice in low resource settings. And then if you are actually collecting the respiration rate incorrectly, then what was happening was that all of the patients were either getting, they could miss something that was really, really serious and severe. So when we build models in these settings based on the real data that is collected, we see that respiratory rate is meaningless, which is extremely surprising, which means what? That we should train them to collect better, right? So it's very obvious when you can see it. But while we don't train them, if it's not being trained because it's such a huge task, and if we don't have resources to do it, at least use the appropriate model. So if that's the status quo, if that's how it's happening, make sure that your model is representing that, because that's the state of the field. Use other things. Don't use a thing that doesn't work, you know? So I think that even if it's being collected poorly, it's still relevant for that period of time. Don't use it. You know, don't use the respiration rate until you have corrected it and that people are making, collecting it in a better way that can maybe be generalized by a model that is used everywhere.
I had one quick question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, please, yeah.
Okay.
I have a question regarding the universality principle, which, by the way, I really love that. And the question relates on data governance and model governance, and especially when it's such a large network of potentially different partners with different kind of perspectives and value sets. How do you collaborate in a setting not between your institute and partners, but between the partners themselves? And how do you govern the models and data sets? And for example, who gets capacity building, who gets treated, who gets maybe extra resources in order to understand the platform while others are not? So how do you ensure that?
Oh yeah, it's such an important question. Like, building the technology is such a small part of all of the things that we have to do. And it's really like I rely a lot on the fantastic people who are working already in ICRC to actually build the partnerships and to identify people and to identify the resources that are needed. The ICRC, for example, I mean, I work with lots of different NGOs, but they're so established and they have such like an established hierarchy in how they work between countries and how they work between different partners as well that they're working with on the outside, that they luckily you can kind of integrate into that partnership. So, for instance, when I was speaking about security levels, there's different kinds of data that can be seen by different kinds of people, and you can actually use that whole structure of who can access what to really understand how model governance should work. because the model is containing all the information. So who should get which model? How should the models be compartmentalized? Which models are exposed to which data, and who can you give those to? And I think those questions are quite well established if you can just map them to the existing organizational infrastructure. And for us, we're trying to make sure that we don't play a role in it at all, eventually. We want to make the technology, and we want to hand it over, and we want the server to be completely internal, right? So the server should be internal within the ICRC, and they should be able to launch any models that they want. Who gets training? We're trying to make sure that training is super minimal. So it's a code-free interface. And if you go into it, you'll just see like, join this, next, this kind of thing. So it's very easy, clickable interface. And it means that all you have to do is just show the model in a drag and drop fashion where your data is, and then it would be able to train on it. But there are some trainings that kind of exist to make sure that the data is at least interoperable, But yeah, it's a challenge. And I think it would have to be rolled out in a very specific use case, case-by-case basis. So you go, only this use case, and let's make sure that everyone has the same data, and let's compare it first to a centralized model, and then make sure that there's trust around it. So it's kind of like a long process, and before you deploy something, you have to really build trust and partnerships in it.
Yeah, I'll keep it shorter from the question. So since you're on the humanitarian side of the project, interactions that you've had, I heard of a privacy project, but I wanted to see if it spawns more connections to what you've seen before. So I heard about a project or like a problem of refugee data of refugees literally on the camp, in the refugee camps, needing a lot of privacy or like secure protections of some sort because of the threat they face from the data exchange happening between conflicting groups or parties. And I don't even know the true situation of how the problem is situated. There's a real problem, but I don't know the systematic aspects of it. I don't know if the data is like on a paper sheet or if it's digitized. I have no detail. Have you heard of any privacy problem of this sort before? Any thoughts around that?
Actually, there's someone who's working on this, Carmela Troncoso, and she's basically doing a cryptographic kind of solution to this, because the refugees, their information can be used maliciously as well by people to kind of say, well, you've crossed over this border, therefore, basically the principles of refoulement don't apply anymore, and you should go back to that country now. So as soon as that knowledge has been kind of accessed by a government that doesn't want the refugee, they can actually then send them back somewhere. As soon as they've traced them and go, oh, but you passed through this country, therefore I'm going to deny you access or send you back to that country. So it's really important to protect their trajectory so that they can kind of have autonomy in how they manage themselves, but they also need to be identified very carefully, because if you're looking for missing persons, you have to map them and kind of follow them. So the solution that was proposed was a cryptographic solution, and it's a very interesting kind of concept. And at the same time, it's also difficult to implement because it requires a lot of compute sometimes, and whatever. It's not a criticism of it. It's just a very tough problem. So I don't think federated learning will work here. I just think I think that's just like a homomorphic encryption kind of thing. Very, very, very challenging problem. I'm not doing that one, thankfully.
Yeah, very exciting. Maybe it motivates someone in the workshop.
Yeah.
It's definitely motivating me a little bit, but yeah.
Let's thank Annie again. And thank you to all the speakers. This has been, at least I enjoyed a lot. I learned a lot. Thank you again. So maybe we go one round of applause for everyone. So we're quite over time. Hopefully, so the plan is now to maybe do like a 20-minute discussion, and then we wrap up the workshop. So hopefully the recording is being stopped or is stopped. It's already stopped. Okay, perfect. So the recording's already stopped. So we'll have like a 15-minute